the dividing line for fans and critics. Released to mixed reviews in 1982, it still finds itself unfairly stuck in the lower tier of album rankings. A troubled project from the start, yet the media missed its core concept, a powerful music homage to the late John Bonham, the heart of Led Zeppelin, a swan song assembled from the archives during the final years of Swan Song Records, created while the band navigated personal agendas, solo albums, film soundtracks, and controversies that would come back to haunt them. I graduated high school in 2004. It was a good year, got my first 2 copies of In Through the Outdoor on CD and vinyl, but my Zeppelin discography remained incomplete as Coda was nowhere to be found. It was the album record store folks didn't know about at all, and I just couldn't afford the complete studio recordings, being completely broke on a teenager budget, but I did have complete for breakfast sometimes. As a classical guitar student at the time, I knew what a coda was, the definite conclusion of a piece of music. It became a reminder on my quest. There was the local Codependents Anonymous, Coda. They couldn't help me either, but give me a codependent stare, wishing me luck in my Zeppelin endeavors. But then in 2006, my luck changed. I found Coda in an almost abandoned audio-video section of a department store. There it was, forgotten, abandoned, and the price? Cheaper than cheap. I had no deep intel on the songs, except I Can Quit You Baby of course, but I read online Bonzo's Montreux was a drum solo. This track was the driving force behind my decision, because yes, I'm a guitarist, but I really wanted to be a drummer, so I really enjoyed drum solos. First time I played the album at home left an impression. While the songs felt like outtakes, I just thought, how could John Bonham be so good? A record I have 8 copies of, a 1982 US pressing, another 1982 US pressing, a 1982 Mexican pressing con títulos en español como Agarrando la Onda, El Camino de Walter, Chica de Ozono y Gastado y Destrozado, a 1982 US cassette copy, a 1982 Obi Insert Japanese pressing, a 1987 Barry Diamond CD with the alternate 80s back cover, a 1994 George Marino CD, and the mighty archive release, the 2015 3-CD deluxe set. This is the making of Coda. November 1980, Jersey Island. Once the 1975 safe house past Robert Plant's car accident, now an unescapable decision. All 3 surviving members and Peter Grant sitting down to discuss future plans. It was a mere formality. Plant was out. There was no let anything for him. John Bonham's passing was tragic beyond belief, a wound that would never fully heal, and little did they know, the band would soon force themselves into a brief posthumous reunion for the sake of unfinished business. First, let me quote the Wikipedia entry for Coda, which notes that the album was released to fulfill contractual commitments to Atlantic Records, while also addressing tax obligations tied to previous earnings. We often hear about the Atlantic side of the story, but the tax element surfaced publicly on Wednesday, December 3rd, 1980, when ITV's World in Action examined the Rossminster case, a complex tax affair that had begun attracting national attention, with Led Zeppelin and George Harrison among the names referenced. Given that the band was still mourning the loss of their friend and drummer John Bonham, the timing of that coverage can feel uncomfortable in retrospect, arriving at a moment when the group was largely out of the public eye. The following day, Led Zeppelin issued a press release formally announcing their permanent breakup.
We wish it to be known that the loss of our dear friend and the deep respect we have for his family, together with the sense of undivided harmony felt by ourselves and our manager, have led us to decide that we could not continue as we were. Signed, Led Zeppelin.
The tax details remain difficult to pin down, but anyone familiar with biographies of artists such as the Rolling Stones or Emerson, Lake and Palmer knows that tax exile had become a harsh reality amid British rates that could reach 83%, a climate George Harrison had already reflected on with Taxman in 1966, and the Stones would later embody through Exile on Main Street. My point is that rock and roll versus the inland revenue was nothing new, yet by 1980 the stakes felt higher than ever. Even for global exports like the Beatles and Led Zeppelin, as their success grew, so did public interest on their finances, matters that many felt were best handled privately and away from headlines. When they were still underdogs, few paid attention, and even fewer believed in their future success. Yet they endured. They were no longer seen as hippies or crazy people. They became legends. True musical legends. Their music transcended countries and languages, becoming a unifying force far beyond the business that surrounded them. Any tax allegations circulating in the press are best understood within the wider climate of the era, because legacies often outlast circumstance. We don't know exactly how the Rossminster situation was ultimately resolved, but it clearly formed part of the wider conversation, shaping the financial and emotional landscape surrounding the band during this troubled period. While Led Zeppelin could no longer continue, it seemed the next chapter of a recorded legacy would become a form of catharsis. And John Lennon's death just days later quickly overshadowed any remaining Zeppelin headlines, rightfully so, as the world began to recognize the closing of one era and the uncertain arrival of another, carrying that weight into the dawn of 1981.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and it is exactly 1981. Happy New Year!
Jimmy Page managed to elevate his long-standing fascination with home recording into something far more deliberate. Key Zeppelin tracks like the song Remains the Same, the Rain Song, and 10 Years Gone had already been developed in advance, shaped within the intimacy of his personal music lab. He carried that mindset into its logical conclusion by purchasing a state-of-the-art professional studio in southeast England, fully committing to control, experimentation, and long-term vision. The story behind Soul Studios is fascinating. I will quote several sources, including this March 1981 article published in The Observer. The property was bought in 1975 by famous English producer and Elton John's right-hand genius, Gus Dudgeon. Despite zoning regulations not allowing commercial use on the site, he pushed through anyway, thus why the 24-track studio wasn't really credited beyond its nicknames, The Mill or The Soul. Fast forward to 1979, and the place was in dire straits over, you guessed it, taxes. Dudgeon's accountant allegedly did not make the proper payments to inland revenue. By May 1980, the mill was on sale. Dudgeon spent some £700,000 restoring and equipping the house for music production, lavish interiors included. The tax bill was around £470,000. Offers were made, and in the summer of 1980, right after Led Zeppelin's last ever concert tour, James Patrick Page became the proud owner of the Soul at a price tag of £350,000. Carrying some of the vibes from Headley Grange, Jimmy's Plumpton Place house, and his love for antiques, it provided a new chapter for one of rock and roll's greatest producers, going to the next decade, ready to press record. Soul Studios was the site for the famous early 1981 XYZ sessions, featuring Page, Chris Squire, and Alan White from Yes. Although they worked out demos for about a month and a half, their managers couldn't agree on a deal. According to Peter Grant's book, Robert Plant came down to visit one day, but he didn't find the material suited for what he was looking for. The timing for XYZ was not the best, but it helped Jimmy stay close to music after Bonham's tragic passing. Squire and White were looking for a band, and were later tipped off about a guy by the name of Trevor Rabin. You can watch my making of 90125 episodes 1 and 2 here on the channel. February 1981 had the British music scene still mourning the passing of John Lennon. Hit single Woman in the UK felt like a collective farewell. Meanwhile, movie theater reruns of The Song Remains the Same gave both old and new fans a kind of timeless, cosmic energy to enjoy, knowing what had been and what could never be again. At the same time, Phil Collins ignited a solo career whose scale of success nobody could have predicted, with In the Air Tonight slowly becoming the song of the 80s. Rainbow climbed the charts with I Surrender, while Britain's rising metal force intensified its attack, Judas Priest charging through side A of Point of Entry, and Iron Maiden unleashing the devastating fury of Killers. Across the Atlantic, Rush arrived at a career-defining sound with moving pictures, moving millions. Slick production without sacrificing substance. The industry's common denominator was unmistakable. Bright-sounding drums, higher stakes, greater impact. While many people in the rock and roll industry hoped Led Zeppelin would reunite at some point, including fastidious rumors of them trying out new drummers, what happened next was a strange way of granting the wish of continuity. Meanwhile, the greatest Led Zeppelin fan, author, and publisher, Dave Lewis, received an unexpected call from Robert Plant. He was asked to gather band photographs and press cutouts. An appointment was set with Jimmy Page and Plant at Swan Song Records on Kings Road. Images were carefully selected for a gatefold collage design. And of course, the meeting confirmed plans that a final album would be released as Led Zeppelin. A potential title, Early Days, Latter Days, was considered, but later discarded. This was revived for a compilation series almost 20 years later. Jimmy Page was a guest during Jeff Beck's show at the Hammersmith Odeon on March 10th. The song was Going Down, and the press said Page was an alarmingly frail-looking genius. Both Yardbirds' guitar heroes reunited on stage for the first time since the late 60s.
Ladies and gentlemen, my dear friend, my school days, and all since then, Jimmy Page.
So what about In Through the Outdoor? Could its continued chart presence have softened the pressure surrounding the band at the time? The album reached the Billboard top positions in America, yet by mid-April 1980, its momentum was clearly fading. While it had single-handedly boosted record industry sales in 1979, the landscape had changed, and revisiting unreleased material would soon emerge as a different way of closing the chapter. Swansong Records' non-Zeppelin releases at the time were not major hits. Neither Midnight Flyer featuring Maggie Bell nor Dave Edmunds' Twanging made much of an impact on the charts. Bad Company's Desolation Angels brought riches in 1979, yet its title could not have been more fitting as breakup sentiments quietly grew. More 1981 albums followed. Sad Cafe's underrated fifth album spawned hit single La Di Da, peaking at 160 on Billboard's 200, while the best of Dave Edmunds followed a similar chart performance. Swansong Records went through the motions, living up to its name, but not enough marketing momentum was going on. Yet they were loyal to their artists till the end. The 1970s were over, and the 80s loomed over the business. Even if John Bonham did not pass away in 1980, Led Zeppelin would have reached a point where recording a new album was unavoidable. It's safe to think they'd use Jimmy's Soul Studios for rehearsals, at least, yet it raises the real question. What kind of material could the band have produced under the weight of that era's emotional and creative pressures? Page himself would later say they wanted to make a more stripped-down hard rock album after the keyboard-dominated direction of In Through the Outdoor. So ironically, the solution they arrived at in 1981 was rooted in the very man they lost. Bonham led the band's now final studio release just as he led them on stage for years, anchoring Zeppelin's power and allowing rhythm and melody to eclipse the competition around them. In that sense, Coda did not betray the band's identity, it quietly reaffirmed the backbone that had always carried it, Bonzo. Interestingly, the atmosphere surrounding that period brought two existing ideas within the Zeppelin camp back into focus. First, there were discussions and handshakes between Atlantic Records' Ahmet Ertegun and the band during the 1980 tour of Europe, aimed at bringing Swansong back onto Atlantic's radar. They struck the deal in good faith, still carrying cautious hopes for the years ahead. Then there was Jimmy Page himself, who had been discussing a possible chronological Zeppelin live album as far back as 1977. The idea of compiling material from 1969 onward was already in his mind, so 1981 became the perfect time to do that in a strange against-the-clock way, and bring a sense of closure to an increasingly complex moment for the band. Choosing outtakes was not new territory for Page. Physical graffiti had already drawn heavily from earlier sessions, proving that Led Zeppelin's past could be reshaped into something cohesive and purposeful. By the early 1970s, the industry had already opened the door to archival and posthumous albums, most visibly through Jimi Hendrix, whose catalog was repeatedly reshaped after his death, beginning with A Cry of Love in 1971 and followed by a long, controversial run of releases that divided critics and fans alike. Some thought it was great, others thought it was too much Hendrix, without Jimi's input. Similar tensions surrounded projects like The Who's Odds and Sods, 1974, The Rolling Stones' Metamorphosis, 1975, Emerson, Lake and Palmer's Works Volume 2, 1977, and later The Beatles' Rarities, whose second volume arrived in March 1980. Page approached the Zeppelin vaults fully aware of that history, searching for material that could function not as leftovers, but as a final statement. What he found included something his former bandmates didn't even know existed, and that discovery would become the starting point for Coda. On the next episode of The Making of Coda, inside the mixing process, overdubs, the album's delayed release, and how Coda ultimately found its redemption over time.